Duane Ollinger just broke through the floor of Blind Frog Ranch. What his drill hit was not rock, it was not water, it was not anything on any geological map that has ever been produced for this region. After years of destroyed equipment, flooded passages, and a financial toll that would have ended any other operation, the ground finally gave something up. And what it gave up has silenced geologists, stumped archaeologists, and left materials analysts without a single clean answer. Subscribe and stay until the very end. Duane Ollinger did not arrive at Blind Frog Ranch by accident. He came with purpose, armed with old geological surveys, historical maps whose documented anomalies pointed at this specific section of the Uinta Basin, and a conviction deep enough that it survived years of the land pushing back in ways that most operators would have read as a clear instruction to leave. He arrived with a plan. What he could not have anticipated was the specific character of the resistance the property would produce in response to that plan. A resistance whose consistency across equipment categories, depth ranges, and operational approaches eventually communicated something to Duane that it did not communicate to the outside observers watching the operation. To them, it looked like failure. To him, it looked like confirmation. Drilling rigs that performed without mechanical issue on other job sites began malfunctioning within hours of deployment on the property. Sensors produced readings that experienced operators with decades of fieldwork behind them had never encountered in any comparable environment. The ground swallowed equipment, collapsed excavation walls behind advancing crews, and flooded passages at the specific moments when the work was getting closest to something significant. A timing pattern whose precision the random behavior of geological bad luck does not account for. Most people would have made the reasonable calculation at some point in that record of active resistance and walked away. Duane made the opposite calculation. He looked at the same evidence: the equipment failures, the flooding events, the electromagnetic interference, the animals that refused to enter specific zones of the property regardless of season or condition, and reached a conclusion that the outside world found difficult to take seriously, but that the discovery this video documents has now validated completely. The resistance was not a warning about the absence of something. It was a response to the presence of something that the ground above it had been protecting for longer than any human investigation of this region has been running. The man who treated that resistance as confirmation rather than rejection is the man who walked into a chamber that should not exist at a depth that every prior excavation on this property had failed to reach. The resistance was real. What it was protecting was realer still. Before Duane Ollinger ever broke ground on Blind Frog Ranch, the data was already telling a story. Not a vague story with suggestive overtones and room for multiple interpretations. A specific, documented, and deeply anomalous story whose specific elements, taken individually, each had a conventional explanation, and whose combined picture, taken together and mapped against each other, did not. The Uinta Basin's geological profile has historically produced results that left researchers without clean answers. The formation sits atop an unusual combination of sedimentary and igneous rock layers that do not behave the way comparable formations do anywhere else in the American West. Water tables move in patterns that contradict standard hydrological models applied to similar geological environments. Magnetic field readings fluctuate in localized zones across the basin without any surface feature whose presence could account for the variation. For most of the scientific community, these anomalies were cataloged and set aside as geological curiosities whose explanation was interesting but not urgent. For anyone paying close enough attention and mapping the anomalies against each other rather than treating each one as an independent data point, they formed something else. They formed a map. The specific section of the basin beneath Blind Frog Ranch sat over one of the most geologically irregular portions of the entire formation. Early sonar work conducted on the property returned images of large subterranean voids arranged in patterns, whose internal organization was inconsistent with the natural cave formation processes that the regional geological literature described. Natural caves follow the path of least resistance through soluble rock. They produce irregular asymmetrical channels shaped entirely by water movement and geological time, without any organizing principle beyond the path of least resistance. What the sonar was showing beneath the property did not follow that pattern. The voids appeared too uniform. Their arrangement was too deliberate. Their depths in several cases exceeded what any water source currently present at the surface could have produced through the dissolution process that natural cave formation requires. Electromagnetic readings taken across the property showed concentrated anomalies located directly above these underground formations. Readings whose correspondence to the sonar-mapped void positions suggested that whatever existed below the surface was actively interacting with the electromagnetic environment above it. The animals on the property refused to enter specific areas consistently, not seasonally, not sporadically, but every time, in a geographic distribution that correlated precisely with the zones the sonar data had flagged as most anomalous. Duane mapped which sections the animals avoided. The correspondence with the underground anomaly distribution was not subtle. The data was telling Duane something was down there long before his equipment confirmed it. What the equipment eventually confirmed exceeded what the data had been able to fully communicate. The excavation history of Blind Frog Ranch is a record of near misses, each one more significant than the last, each one close enough to produce the specific quality of frustration that comes not from finding nothing but from finding enough to know that something enormous is just beyond the reach of the current approach. In the earliest phases of the investigation, the crew focused on surface-level anomalies whose evidence the sonar data had identified as the most accessible expressions of the underground formation. Sinkholes appearing without seismic activity, discolored soil patches suggesting buried metallic material at shallow depths, shoreline formations along the ranch's water features that looked shaped rather than naturally deposited. What those early digs produced was already remarkable in isolation. Metal alloy fragments whose composition field analysis could not match to any ore body documented in the regional geological record. Carved stone pieces bearing markings that the regional archaeologists consulted could not immediately classify within any known indigenous tradition from this area or any comparable area. Traces of refined material, processed, not raw, at depths that should have predated any human activity with the metallurgical capability to produce them. Every artifact from the early phase pointed in the same direction. Downward, the crew pushed deeper across subsequent seasons with more sophisticated drilling equipment and consultants whose backgrounds in mining, structural geology, and archaeology gave the operation a more comprehensive analytical framework for what it was finding. What they encountered as they descended was a submerged cave network whose scale had not appeared clearly in the original surveys. Water-filled passages stretching laterally beneath the property in multiple directions, connecting in some cases to underground reservoirs whose water sources had no clear surface origin. Divers who entered the accessible portions of these passages came back with reports that did not fit the geological models. The geometry was too consistent. The surfaces in specific sections were too smooth. In at least one documented instance, a passage appeared to widen into a chamber of significant size before the visibility conditions forced the team to surface. When the divers surfaced and gave Duane their report, the people who were present said he did not speak for almost 2 minutes. He stood at the water's edge and looked at it. That chamber became the target of every subsequent operation on the property. The flooded conditions, the depth, and the geological instability of the surrounding formation made direct access impossible with the equipment available in those earlier seasons. Every season brought the crew closer. Every season, the ranch found a new way to deny it, until the season whose breakthrough this video documents. Every prior attempt to reach the primary chamber had been stopped by the same combination of factors. Water intrusion terminating bore holes before they reached target depth. Structural instability in the surrounding rock collapsing excavation approaches before they could be secured. The sheer depth of the target relative to the drilling capacity available in the earlier operational configurations. What changed in the most recent excavation phase was not luck, and it was not a sudden improvement in the property's cooperation with the investigation. It was methodology. After working with a structural geologist whose background included deep extraction projects in similarly unstable sedimentary environments, the team made a fundamental change to the approach. Instead of drilling straight down toward the chamber from directly above, the approach that had produced the most severe resistance events across every prior attempt, they identified a lateral entry point on the western edge of the property where the underground water table was significantly lower and the rock composition offered more stable conditions for sustained excavation work. That single methodological shift changed everything. The lateral entry angle allowed the crew to advance at depth without immediately encountering the flooded passages that had terminated every prior vertical approach at the same critical depths. Progress was slow and required continuous monitoring of the surrounding formation for instability indicators at every stage of advancement. But for the first time in the history of the operation, the ground was not actively collapsing the work behind them as they moved forward. Duane was on site for every day of this phase. People who were there have said he barely left the property during the active excavation period. New ground-penetrating radar brought in specifically for this phase returned images of the target chamber at a resolution that no prior survey had achieved. And what the data showed when those images came back was something none of the prior surveys had established with this level of specificity. The chamber was not a single void. It was a connected series of spaces, a network, and the largest of them registered at dimensions that made every member of the crew go quiet when Duane read the numbers to them. He looked at the numbers for a long time. Then he told the team to keep drilling. The electromagnetic fluctuations that had been plaguing the property's equipment for years intensified sharply at a specific depth during this phase, concentrating directly along the path the new entry angle was following. In prior phases, that electromagnetic intensification had been the signature of the resistance events that destroyed equipment and terminated approaches. This time, Duane made a different call. Instead of treating the electromagnetic signal as interference to work around, the team started using it as a live indicator that they were moving in the right direction. The deeper they went, the stronger it got. The same force that had been working against the investigation for years was now pointing at something. Duane followed it down. At a depth that exceeded every prior excavation on the property by a significant margin, the drill broke through into open space. Duane Ollinger was standing 10 feet from the bore when it happened. The instrument spiked across every measurement category simultaneously: electromagnetic, acoustic, vibration, thermal, in the specific coordinated pattern that the prior season's resistance events had produced in reverse. Where the resistance had concentrated instrument anomalies as a barrier, the breakthrough produced them as a release. The crew went silent, and then in the space where there should have been rock, the instruments confirmed what the sound of the drill had already communicated. There was nothing, an opening, a void. The chamber they had been trying to reach for years was real. It was exactly where the data said it would be, and it was waiting. The moment the bore broke through, something changed on the surface that everyone present has described in the same terms, independent of each other, and independent of any coordination in their accounts. Not the instrument spike, though that happened. Not the sound of the breakthrough, though there was one, something harder to quantify. A shift in the atmospheric quality of the immediate environment. A change in pressure or presence whose specific character none of the crew members who experienced it have been able to describe in technical terms, but all of whom have described in experiential terms that are consistent across their independent accounts. Like the space below had been holding something in, and the breakthrough released it. Duane was the first one through the access point when the bore had been widened enough to permit entry. What he walked into was not what any geological model of the underground environment of this section of the Uinta Basin had predicted. Not because the chamber's existence was a surprise. The data had been pointing at it for years, because the chamber's character, once the headlamp illuminated it in full, communicated something about what had produced it that no geological model was equipped to explain. He stopped moving when the light resolved the walls. He stood there for a moment that nobody timed but everyone present remembers, and then he started documenting. The walls were not raw rock. Every person who entered that chamber in the period following the breakthrough has described that finding in the same terms and with the same specific quality of emphasis. The walls were not raw rock. Sections of the interior surface showed clear evidence of deliberate treatment, a smoothing and apparent reinforcement of the wall material that could not be attributed to natural erosion, water action, or any geological process that operates in this type of formation under these conditions. The crew documented it systematically. Geologists who reviewed the documentation confirmed it. The surfaces had been worked. The geometry of the space itself was the next striking element. Natural cavern chambers form in response to the irregular dissolution of soluble rock, producing asymmetrical, organically shaped voids with variable ceiling heights and uneven floors whose irregularity reflects the randomness of the dissolution process. What the team entered was not that. The proportions were consistent across the primary section of the chamber in a way that natural formation processes do not produce. The ceiling height remained stable across the chamber's primary span. The floor, partially covered in sediment accumulated over a span of time, the geologists on site were careful to avoid characterizing in specific terms, showed evidence of an underlying surface that was level in a way that the natural dissolution of rock in this geological environment cannot produce. Embedded in the sediment layer and partially exposed along one of the treated wall sections, the crew found metallic objects, large ones, in significantly better condition than the anomalous fragments the surface-level excavations had recovered in the prior seasons. Field analysis of the recovered material could not match its elemental composition to any ore body documented in the regional geological record or to any naturally occurring combination of elements found in comparable geological environments anywhere in the American West. Then, the markings. Along one of the treated wall sections, partially obscured by mineral deposit buildup, whose accumulation the geologists on site estimated had occurred across an extraordinary span of time. A series of deliberate markings covered a continuous portion of the treated surface, not random, not the product of mineral crystallization or natural erosion patterning, arranged with a consistency and an intentionality that left no member of the team with a conventional explanation for what had produced them. Every scientific explanation subsequently applied to the chamber's complete evidence record breaks down at a specific point. The natural formation argument cannot account for the geometric consistency of the proportions. The mathematics of how this rock formation would dissolve under the water and pressure conditions present in this part of the basin do not produce the shape the crew entered. The indigenous craftsmanship argument runs into depth and access. The chamber sits at a depth that would have required excavation technology far beyond anything attributed to any pre-Columbian population in the Uinta Basin, and the natural alloying explanation for the metallic objects fails against the specific elemental ratios present in the recovered material, which do not correspond to any naturally occurring combination documented in the literature for this region. Not impossible, simply unexplained. That is where the scientific conversation about what the Blind Frog Ranch chamber contains is currently sitting. Blind Frog Ranch does not exist in isolation. To understand what the chamber discovery actually means, it is necessary to understand what surrounds it, what the broader Uinta Basin has been producing across the full span of the documented investigation history of this region, and how the physical access to a constructed underground chamber changes the interpretation of everything else the basin has been documented producing. The Uinta Basin stretches across a vast section of the Colorado Plateau, one of the more remote and historically understudied regions in the continental United States, whose specific geological and anomalous characteristics the scientific community has engaged with selectively rather than comprehensively. The Ute people, whose ancestral connection to this land predates any written record, have maintained across generations that this basin is a place of threshold, a region where the boundary between the physical world and something operating alongside it is thinner than anywhere else. Their oral traditions describe the land as capable of responding to human presence and actively resisting specific kinds of intrusion. That was treated as mythology by the institutions whose scientific frameworks were not equipped to receive it as anything else. The documented evidence accumulating across this basin for the past several decades makes a compelling case that it deserves a more serious hearing than mythology permits. Skinwalker Ranch sits less than 15 miles from Blind Frog Ranch. The phenomena documented there across multiple investigation programs, aerial objects performing maneuvers that violate known aerodynamic principles, electronic equipment failing in localized zones with a consistency that rules out random mechanical failure, animals disappearing without biological trace, underground anomalies detected through sonar and ground-penetrating radar at depths whose geological profile does not account for the readings, mirror the catalog of anomalies at Blind Frog with a specificity that is difficult to attribute to coincidence or to independent geological quirks of adjacent properties. The government-affiliated AAWSAP research program conducted at Skinwalker Ranch referenced underground anomalies as a component of the broader phenomenon whose investigation the program organized. The chamber beneath Blind Frog Ranch may be the first direct physical access point to whatever network of underground structures underlies this entire stretch of the basin. If the connected voids the ground-penetrating radar identified extend laterally toward adjacent properties, and the sonar data suggests they may, what Duane found is not a feature of his ranch. It is a node, one access point in a system that runs beneath the entire region, and that possibility changes the question the discovery opens from what is under Blind Frog Ranch to what has been operating beneath the Uinta Basin, and whether everything documented on its surface for generations is the symptom of something whose physical infrastructure Duane Ollinger just walked into. Duane Ollinger arrived at Blind Frog Ranch as a treasure hunter. That is the most accurate description of what he was when this investigation began. A geological theory about buried gold, a rationale for why this specific parcel of Utah land was the right place to look for it, a determination to find it and extract it. The man who walked into that chamber is not that person anymore. What the ranch has done to Duane Ollinger across the years of this investigation is not easy to categorize because it does not fit any of the conventional narratives that sustained anomalous investigation experiences produce in the people who undergo them. It has not broken him, though there were seasons where it came close, and nobody watching would have blamed him for breaking. It has not converted him into a simple believer in the paranormal. Duane is constitutionally resistant to explanations that cannot be tested, and that character has not changed across the investigation's duration. What it has done is systematic. It has dismantled, piece by piece and season by season, every framework he brought to the property, and replaced it with something more honest and more uncomfortable. The direct observational experience of a man who has been shown that the frameworks he brought with him were inadequate to the reality found. He said something in the footage from the chamber that has stayed with every crew member who was present for it. Standing in the middle of the silence that the chamber produced in the documentation team, the silence of people standing somewhere that by every model they possess for how the world works should not exist, he said that he did not know what the chamber was, but that not knowing was the honest answer. That is a profoundly different statement from anything the man who arrived at Blind Frog Ranch with a geological theory about buried gold would have made. The discovery has not resolved Duane's mission, it has transformed it. The question is no longer whether something of significance exists beneath the ranch. That question has been physically answered in a form that no subsequent institutional skepticism can undo. The questions that remain are of a fundamentally different order. What was the chamber built for? What created the markings on its walls and over what span of time? Do the connected voids the radar data identified contain additional material or additional evidence of something that no field model yet possesses a category for? Is accessing those deeper sections of the underground network physically possible without triggering the structural failures that terminated every prior excavation approach? These are the questions that the discovery has opened, and Duane Ollinger is not done asking them. If the chamber beneath Blind Frog Ranch was constructed, and the geometric consistency of its proportions, the treated walls, the deliberate markings, and the impossibility of accounting for its existence through any natural geological process leave constructed as the most defensible description, then something built it. The depth eliminates every conventional human population from the list of candidates. The archaeological record for this region has no category for what the evidence shows, which means one of two things must be true. Either the timeline is wrong, or the builders have never appeared in it. That is where the physical evidence puts anyone who engages honestly with what the chamber contains. Not a theory, not an instrument reading, a physically accessed underground space that the full analytical framework of the relevant scientific disciplines cannot currently explain. Duane came looking for gold. He found a chamber that should not exist, containing materials nobody can identify, covered in markings nobody can read. Whatever has been operating beneath the Uinta Basin has been doing so far longer than any investigation of its surface has been running. Duane just found the door. What is on the other side is the question everything has been building toward.